Welcome to Monologues by Hassie, where I'm going to be dropping unsolicited brain dumps from the depths of my grey matter. I'll talk about life, money, society, and self-development, plus whatever else lies up there, whilst hopefully not getting cancelled in the process. As I've been traveling through Vietnam and Laos, my podcasting frequency has been a little bit erratic. And part of this is because I've been immersing myself in the experiences. And a particularly great one that I had a few weeks ago was trekking through a region of northern Vietnam known as Sapa with a Hmong guide. And I chose a 3-day trek, which apparently a lot of tourists don't like. And even for that 3-day trek, I picked a destination which is considerably less touristy. In fact, I was almost the only other person who went to the final stop. It just happened to be me and one other fellow traveler who went out that way, and we were with separate companies, and we happened to meet along the way with our Hmong guides. And it was one of these things where, because I was with that Hmong guide, and it was just me and her, and then eventually the other traveler and her Hmong guide, we all got to learn about their culture in a way that I normally wouldn't have been able to if I was in a big group of tourists. And one of the things that initially blew my mind was that these women were so young. So my guide was 32 years old, and she had 4 children, and the type of maturity that you will see from these women is very different to what I'm used to having grown up in the Western world. And then the other Hmong guide, so our other trekking guide, they're both black Hmong women, and that's their tribe. They surprised me because the ages that they got married were so young that it would raise significant concerns in the Western world. And one of the guides was actually 20 years old. She was 20 years old. She already had 2 kids. She'd been married for 5 years. But the way she gushed about her husband was absolutely incredible. And my guide, we were picking herbs for her husband. The way that their families worked, and she said that, me and my husband will take turns cooking, and one will do the cleaning, and her job requires her to be out trekking with tourists throughout the day. So her husband's the one who's at home tending to the rice fields and looking after the kids most of the time. But it was rather interesting because I think initially when you hear these things, you can be very taken back because they definitely they raise alarm bells with our Western sensitivities. If you hear about somebody getting married at 15 years old or 16 years old, that wouldn't really happen in the West. In the West, you might have a teen pregnancy and that'll get frowned upon. But the idea of marrying 2 people together at that age when you're a kind of mid-teenager is unheard of. But in the Hmong culture, the traditional culture, for them, that is an age where women typically go and get married. And initially, I was very, very concerned about it. And I'm sure there are still aspects of that are concerning. But the more I spoke to the 2 women who were leading me and this other traveler along our journey to trekking through the Sapa Valley, I got to ask more questions and understand more about their relationships and how their family dynamics work, and it was very interesting. As I said, they both gushed about their husbands. They seemingly had very good relationships, and I got to learn so much about their culture. That wealth was dictated by the number of rice flats, that a woman will keep her name, whereas the children will take the name of the father. So it was very interesting how these things work out. But they were telling me, I was asking them, so how did you meet your husbands? And it all sounds very modern. It was almost a modern twist with the traditional expectation that you're going to get married at a younger age, and that's acceptable in their culture. And my guide, who's 32 years old, so she's only 2 years older than me, was telling me, me and my husband, we started texting. He came to my village to visit his grandmother, and when he was visiting his grandmother and in my village, then we exchanged numbers and we texted for a few months and we got married. And I was like, wow, that even though there are parts of your story which, again, initially raised alarm bells with my Western sensibilities, this all seems very modern. You were literally sending SMS messages and talking across your villages and then deciding to get married, and you bring the parents together and boom, done. And now she's got 4 children and she's a tour guide doing very well for herself, has self-taught English. These are very, very impressive women. And same goes for the 20-year-old tour guide, who I was also shocked to learn, on top of having been married for 5 years, almost 5 years, had been working as a tour guide for 5.5 years. So she'd been working for a company since she was 14 years old, taking tourists through the Sapa mountain ranges and valleys on these trekking adventures. And I thought, well, in Australia, that would be like a child labor law. And then I thought, as somebody who wants to be a parent one day, would I ever send my daughter alone with a group of Western tourists to go and do a 30-kilometer trek over 3 days? I would probably say absolutely not. But for her, this is something they did. And this is something that her family, her family as in her parents, mother and father, as well as her new family, were fine with her working at that younger age. But then she told me, but I've been doing this since I was 10. And one thing you notice when you trek through some of these areas is a lot of the natives and locals will try to sell you the handiworks that they're producing. And they will follow you 4 kilometers in the hope that you will eventually buy some of their handicrafts. And the children who do this are often very young. And me personally, I don't like to buy from children. One of the things I learned when I was in Cambodia earlier in the year is do not buy from children because it keeps them out of school. If you're buying from children and it's school time and they're out here trying to sell you something, then that's the last person you want to buy from. But my tour guide was telling me she'd been selling since she was about 10 years old, walking with her family, and she would have been carrying these handicrafts to sell. And through that process, she learnt the trekking routes that tourists like to go through and that people generally take tourists through. She also learnt how to speak English. And the level of English that these women had was incredible, considering that they've had no formal education. And they said the women in the Hmong tribes actually learn English and Vietnamese to a better degree than the men do, because they're exposed to commerce and because they have to sell to the local Vietnamese and they have to sell to Western tourists who generally speak some English, that they've been able to develop these very incredible language skills. But for me, the idea of, as I said, sending my daughter out alone to take Western tourists at the age of 14 is absolutely mind-boggling. But it was something that, in their world, this was very common. And this tour guide was incredibly professional, and she was only 20 years old and probably one of the most mature women ever. And I remember the other traveler I was going with and she was 26 and I was 30, and we were just talking about this in our own time. She was saying, it seems like, they have the freedom of choice has been taken away. Like, I'm 26 and I still feel like a baby. And that's what she was saying. There's a part of that I definitely agree with. But I'm sure at the same time that they look at us and our culture and the way we live our lives, the fact that I'm a 30-year-old man and I have no kids, they probably look at us and think we are absolutely insane for the way we lead our lives. And we might be looking at them and thinking that they're insane for the way they lead their lives. And it really made me think that, yes, there are some things which I think are going to be universally abhorrent. So some of the things when these Hmong women were teaching us their traditions, they said in the old days there used to be bride kidnapping, and we don't do that anymore. And that absolutely is horrible. And there are many things that happen in cultures around the world where you visibly know they're horrible. Because if you saw that and you see distress in another human's eyes, in a child's eyes, or anyone, you know that is inherently a bad thing. You do not need any cultural sense of morality to see that another human being is harmed. But in this particular instances, I was speaking to 2 women who were both married in their teens and have many children and have been working since they were very young. And this touches many issues, from being married at a young age, from child labor, to how these relationships work. But the more I asked questions and the more they told me, we got to see them interact with their husbands. It was really my concerns were eased, and I was very happy that these women were happy. And it's not something, I'm not saying this is something that I would encourage, but one of the biggest things I've learnt on this trip is there is the golden rule. And I think when we as Westerners come to other cultures, we kind of treat the things we see with the golden rule, in that we believe other people should be treated the way that we want to be treated. But one thing that I've come to realize is it's more important to apply the platinum rule when encountering these foreign cultures. Now, that's not to say you're not going to encounter things that are extremely abhorrent and you shouldn't tolerate. But there is a place for the platinum rule in that people should be treated, and we should view other cultures in the way they view themselves. And it comes down to things as simple as cuisine. If you look at cuisine, I got invited in Laos to something called a Basi ceremony, which is a beautiful ceremony, and the elders bless everybody else, and everyone ties these strings, and they're all connected to a table. It's very hard for me to explain, but you basically have a ceremony where everyone is connected to everyone else. So they're physically touching a table. If you can't touch the table in the center, you touch somebody else who is touching the table. So everyone is spiritually connected. And then at the end, there are pieces of white cotton string, and these are tied around everyone's hands, and you give each other a blessing as you go and do this process. It's a beautiful ceremony. And that's a part of a culture which is very easy to take on. And then I was eating a dish later, after the ceremony, which was congealed buffalo blood. Very different. I found it rather tasty. After the first few bites, it took some time to acclimatize to it. But there are many foods I've encountered around the world, be it tarantulas or cockroaches or grasshoppers or banana worms, which I just saw in Laos recently, which are almost like witchetty grubs. For those of you who are familiar with the Australian food that some indigenous folk eat, is that we can look at these cultures and look at their foods, and we can apply this Western kind of sensibility to it and say, oh, that's not real food, we shouldn't be eating that. And there are animals that other cultures eat that we don't necessarily eat, that for us, it's a pet. But for them, it's food. And I say this as somebody who owns a dog, who's definitely seen signs in Vietnam that there's dog meat being served. But when we encounter these cultures, we should be applying the platinum rule. And of course, there are many things that we should not tolerate. If you think about something like whaling and protecting an endangered species, then we shouldn't tolerate the hunting of whales. But there are many just different foods that people eat around the world, and different ways that people engage in relationships, and different ways that people work. And for us, these might seem like alien concepts. These people seem oppressed, and we have this strange sense of empathy, which is not really empathy. We just think people should conform to Western standards and our Western sensibilities, that it doesn't particularly make sense. In fact, when this 3-day trek that I did through the Supper Valley and mountain range ended, on the last day we said, so do you guys get a break after this? And because for us, it's like they've been doing this for 3 days, and we hope that they get to spend some time at home. Mind you, these women were going home every day. Their husbands came on bikes and picked them up and brought them back. So they didn't stay with us when we stopped at a village. They would meet us the next morning. So they did go back to their families after every day. But we said, wouldn't it be nice for you to have a weekend or a day or two off? And the young girl said, no, if there's work available, if the company says there's a group going, yeah, I definitely want to do it. And this is, again, something where we want to apply the Western way that things are done to their world. But for them, it's very different. For them, they value being on that tour and being able to earn more income, because it's a different equation for them than it is for us. And the biggest takeaway that I've had from traveling the world and encountering these cultures, such as the Hmong women I met, such as being in that Lao Basi ceremony and eating foods that I normally wouldn't eat, is you need to treat people the way that they want to be treated. And that's the platinum rule. And there are times where you need to break all these rules because there is something clearly very, very wrong going on. But I think the majority of the cultures around the world, they have evolved. Just like the women were saying that they don't do bride kidnapping anymore. They have changed. Even they have realized that there are parts of their culture which need to change. And there are many parts of Western culture which could be changed down the track. But the idea that we come from a place of superiority and that what other people do is by default wrong. Now, it might be wrong, but what I'm getting at with the point of this podcast is, by default, it doesn't need to be wrong. We shouldn't be looking at these foreign cultures from the perspective of the golden, treat people as we want to be treated. So, like I said, those women didn't necessarily want a day off. That's what I might have wanted, and that would be the golden rule. But for them, they wanted the opportunity to do another trek and to earn more income. So it's very important to keep that in mind when meeting other cultures, is that there will be things that will shock you. But I think you should probe further than what might be superficially alarming, and ask questions. And I'm so happy that I've been able to ask questions. I'm so happy that I've been invited into people's homes to experience their culture, and that I think I have a newfound respect and new lens in which I can view cultures I encounter in the future. And I think it makes for a better way of going through life, because one thing I noticed about the fellow traveler I was with is there was almost an unease, a sense of agitation because of the clash of her culture or our culture, Western culture, and what we were encountering as we were speaking with these Hmong women and going through this honestly, very beautiful journey through the SuperValu, but learning about their culture, which is very different to ours. So I'm going to leave this episode there, and to all of you listening to this, I wish you great success on all your endeavors. You've just made it through another episode of Monologues by Hassie. It brings me great pleasure to know that you made it to the end. To listen to more episodes, subscribe on your favorite podcast app or visit monologuesbyhassie.com. Thanks for swinging by.